invite our guests to take their seats. There's a saying in Washington that the most dangerous place for a panel is to be, between a long day of discussion and the reception. But this is actually the best panel, I think. We have some very distinguished and exciting guests. We've been fortunate at Meridian to have a great relationship with the diplomatic community as a center for diplomacy and leadership, and as well with the OECD, which is something we all refer to as a basis for benchmarks to look at different issues we're trying to work on. So you have the biographies in front of you, but I'd like to just welcome the Chargé d'Affaires. For those of you that are new to diplomacy, that is the acting ambassador, Yeliswa Mbebe, Ambassador Jonathan Zeviov of Estonia, Ambassador Fernando Lorca of Costa Rica, and Will Davis, the head of the OECD Washington office. We're here to talk about education and how we can, look at the skills gap that is growing and also provides an opportunity for both distance learning and face-to-face education. And I think all of you have an important perspective. But I wanted to start with Yeliswa, perhaps. South Africa has made an effort on education reform, particularly at the secondary school level, revised standards, and has made a push to adapt and modernize the education system. And I was wondering if you could share from South Africa's perspective a little bit of lessons learned, what you're trying to do, what you hope to achieve with this.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Holiday, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm joined by Sergeant Anthony, who is from the South African Embassy and is responsible for the education cooperation between South Africa and the United States of America. I think for me it is quite crucial that I preface my presentation to say, as a country, I'm sure you all know where we're coming from in terms of our history. And we still are bearing the scars of that history into our education system even today. In the past, we had two different education systems where the minority had a privileged education system. They were trained for the future, and you have minority of people that went through the Bantu education and were just trained for manual labor. So they were not really trained to take on the future of work. I'm the product of that Bantu education myself, and was lucky enough to have parents who wanted to push regardless of all the boundaries and inequalities of the time. And a lot of youth in South Africa today are still undergoing the very same inequality in terms of education. They either leave school not because they don't want to, but because of circumstances. And they are not well educated because the public schooling system, even though the government has made strides to make sure that we have funding, we have right policies, processes, and structures in place, but funding without quality education results in the very same poverty and unemployment that we're trying to address as a country. And that, at the end of the day, affects the economy of the country. It's like a cycle. And a lot of the people that went through the Bantu education system are still in the education system, either as parents, either as teachers, and therefore there's just, the evolution is not as quick as we would love it to be as a country. And perhaps just to say some of the gaps that we identified pre-94 was to say, how do we then standardize the education system for the country so that it does not benefit a few, but benefits all of us, and that we have equal life opportunities for education and therefore for future of work. So government had to introduce a lot of policies. had to reform a lot of policies that were also there at the time that were just not responsive to what we're trying to achieve, reskilling and refocusing the education system of the country. And as we were implementing a lot of those policies, I guess we also got fatigue of the very same policies that we're trying to bring up and implement. But also take into account that as we are introducing those policies, you needed to make sure that we have good structures in place to implement those. You needed to make sure that we have people, whether it's school principals, whether it's school governing bodies, as we have, that would then implement these policies. But also, in South Africa, you cannot do without labor unions. They are part of our history. They are part of the very same education system. So they needed all of them to be there to say, how do we then implement these policies?
Unions of teachers and educators.
Educators mainly, which is SATU. So they are part of this, and they all have different interests in the very same education system of the country. So we introduced more than 30 policies. We're still introducing policies even today. But the truth of the matter is we still have a public schools that are funded by government, but quality is still not up to standard. And that's the truth of the matter. And it affects the youth. It really affects the youth because now they can't go out there and sort employment and sort to upgrade themselves. So what the government did then was to sign up the Constitution. The Constitution then said everyone has got a right to education. That then means everyone from grade R to grade 9 has to go through education. And government will pay for that, but you still had private schooling for those that can afford private schooling. Government at this point in time is not spending less than 6% of our GDP to public schooling.
6%.
6%, and I'm sure Mr. Davis will agree with me when I say that is on par and probably more than other countries within the OECD that are really budgeting within their schooling system.
And just for the audience, I'm sure they know the population of South Africa is
almost 57 million people at this point in time.
And probably a pretty young population.
Pretty young. We're still sitting at 29% unemployment. And out of that, 56.6 is youth that I'm talking about. It's youth that is not in post-secondary schooling, is youth that drop out of school for various factors. It's youth that did not have the opportunity, even though you do have public schooling system, but because of the quality, they then drop up. And for other reasons that the government is also trying to address. The Constitution is there. It provides direction, it provides guidance. Structures are in place. As a result, the government used to have one national Department of Education that deals with both basic and higher education. But at some point, we then realized that this is just a too much task for one cabinet minister because you needed to focus on early and secondary education and then have a different focus on post and vocational training. And that's why we then had a split between basic education and the higher education. Now, the other effect of that is that those two governments at some point need to talk. And at some point you find them working in silos because the one feeds the other and still are trying very hard to make sure that those two governments still function as one government that is looking forward to the education.
Obviously there's employers as well that have to be brought in.
There's employers.
There has to be this dialogue between the educators and the employers at some point to have that continuity.
You still have labor unions. You can leave them out.
And
We've got school governing bodies. These are parents.
Yeah.
They also need to be part of this. So there are a lot of different stakeholders. And as I said, they all have different interests. But at the end of the day, the interest is to make sure that we have an education system in South Africa that responds to the needs of the country, both social and economically.
Are you optimistic?
Ambassador, I am very optimistic. We're 25 years into our democracy. There's a lot of expectation. But as I'm sitting here as a government representative, government cannot do it on our own. Yes, we've put money aside, but we need partners. And I'm glad when I'm sitting here, I've been 2 years now in the US, we've got stable partners with the US government, with the US private sector that are supportive of education in South Africa. And I can say that without hesitation that partnership is very crucial for us. Other than that, Africa as a whole, we cannot not change the narrative of education without partners such as the US.
And I think one of the exciting things about South Africa is as Africa becomes more of a global focus for economic activity and really as a potential driver of entrepreneurship, but that South Africa has the opportunity to be that bridge into the rest of the continent as well. So having the workforce educated and the ability to have those businesses and employers based there is very important. But I wanted to come back, if I could, in a minute to shift to a different part of the world, Estonia. I think it's hard to pick up a magazine or newspaper without hearing about the technological innovation and the leadership that Estonia has been able to establish in this particular sector. I was wondering if you could share, how have you been able to do that? And obviously you have a smaller population, but you've emerged, in some ways you've also had this emergence from a different piece of history with years of Soviet occupation, and had to develop a voice and a differentiation for your country. But education's pretty key to that. But you focused on technology in particular.
Well, yes, thank you. First of all, thank you all for being here. And as I was listening, I think you're absolutely right. It's hard to find geographically or in other ways countries as far apart as South Africa and Estonia are. And yet, there are certain striking similarities. I mean, our present, to a large extent, is shaped by our past, our history. And our future, of course, is not dependent upon our past, but on our ability to learn from our past and to shape our present circumstances. Now, we are a country in Northern Europe, a country of 1.3 million people, so one of the smallest nations in Europe when it comes to their population. As Western as a country can possibly be. I was at another think tank event a few weeks ago, and the ad said that Estonia is a pro-Western country, and I got angry at the ad because, of course, we have never been a pro-Western country. We are not a pro-Western and never will be a pro-Western country. We are the West and have been the West for thousands and thousands of years. And the only reason why our recent history puts us in the political Eastern European category is that as the Second World War ended and our Western European brothers and sisters were liberated by the free world, we were not, and had to live not just for a few years, but for half a century under totalitarian occupation, which then ended in 1991. We're right now celebrating 30 years with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I keep reminding people that this is a German party for sure. It is also a party for us because we too were behind that wall, and again with a nuance that matters. As the wall came down, we were still occupied for 2 more years, and then for 4 more years or 3.5 more years, we had Soviet and Russian troops in our country not willing to leave. In any case, in 1991 we re-emerged on the map, not as a new nation, but a nation that has regained its independence, not as a pro-Western nation, but a Western nation that needs to reintegrate itself with Western institutions, and also a nation that needs to rebuild its economy. For those who have been to Estonia, you hopefully know Estonia is a technologically advanced, clean, modern, European country. Well, in 1991, we had almost nothing when it comes to the economy. And our close brothers and sisters across the Bay of, or the Gulf of Finland, the Finns, who had managed to maintain their independence throughout the Cold War, we looked at Finland, and through Finland we looked at the rest of Europe, and we saw economic development that we knew we needed to achieve. So if we had done what others had done, we would never have been able to catch up. But catching up was a clear national goal. So there was an understanding in the government, in the private sector, in the society in general, that we needed to leapfrog. We needed to do something that would help bridge that gap, 50-year-long gap. It's a pretty big gap to bridge. Now, we were lucky because that was the time when the internet was becoming a thing. And we noticed that indeed the private sector is going online, the banks, others are starting to offer services online. So the government successive governments, this is not a political statement, so successive governments made a number of smart decisions. They started issuing digital IDs so that people could identify themselves online, which also helps us to now sign documents in a legally binding way, digitally. They also realized that, well, if the private sector is going online, the government needs to go online and start offering services online. So we built not just the different databases and servers that I think every government does in the world, we made sure they link with each other. And we also made sure that the private sector is on board, because without that, the government services, we think, would never have caught on online. So today, we conduct more than 98% of bank transactions online. We conduct most of our business with the government online. There are actually two services, public services, that are not offered online, and those are for emotional, not practical reasons. One is getting married, so you still have to show up at a government office to get married, or the church or whatnot, but you have to show up in physical form. And the second one is buying real estate, and that's only because buying real estate is one of the, sort of emotionally, one of the biggest things a person does. You can buy and sell cars. You go to see a doctor, you never fill out a piece of paper. You never fill out a piece of paper. Everything is in digital form. There is never a paper prescription that moves from the doctor to you or from you to the pharmacy. Everything is digital. Most documents are signed digitally. When our president signs bills into law, then most often she does that with a digital signature, not with a physical one. So all in all, we think we save approximately 2% of our GDP annually just by signing documents digitally. And we think we save approximately 5 days per person per year, simply because nobody ever has to stand in a line. Nobody ever goes to a DMV, nobody ever goes to some other government office. We do our taxes in less than 5 minutes usually, in 3 minutes or so. It was actually a funny story. When Jeb Bush was running for president, he came to Estonia, had lunch with our prime minister, then prime minister, and the prime minister told him the story. Jeb Bush came back and gave a number of speeches using Estonia as an example. So you can do digital stuff. And the question is, what's in it for the citizen? Well, one of the things is you do your taxes in 5 minutes. So Bush gave that speech. And then it was one of the newspapers, the Washington Post or something else that assesses the truthfulness of political candidates' statements. And he didn't get the maximum, like the Pinocchio test, basically. So he didn't get a maximum. He got a good grade, but not the maximum. And his campaign got angry and asked, how come? I mean, I was told this story by the Prime Minister of Estonia. How come I didn't get the maximum? And then the paper said, well, Governor, you said they do their taxes in 5 minutes, whereas in reality they do their taxes in 3. So he didn't get it.
I wanted to ask you a question about, did Estonia have a legacy of strong math and science and engineering that you could build on as you sort of set out your course, or did you really have to rebuild the education system?
So we did. We've always had a good education system. Currently we're in the top. I think we're number 1 in the Pisa test scores. Usually it's us and the Finns. We take great pride in our education system. But what's neat about the Estonian digital revolution, if you will, is that the technology that we use is not necessarily cutting edge. The technology is off the shelf. The digital ID is based on the same technology that any bank ATM card has been based on for decades now. It's a chip, a plastic card with a chip on it. and a PIN code that's in your head. The encryption is not cutting edge. We didn't develop it. It's bought. It's off the shelf. The X-Road, which is our data highway that connects all the different government databases. I mean, our companies built it, but it's nothing. It's not cutting edge in the application of technology. In that sense, what is cutting edge is the flexibility of our legal system, and the way we have made it possible for the society, not only the government but the private sector as well, to utilize technology that is already out there. And one of the lessons that we took, I think we were either lucky or we had smart people in the right place at the right time. In any case, we determined that we must avoid over-regulation. If we start creating laws for every new technology, then we will never be able to catch up. Technology is faster than any government. It's faster than any big bank or telecommunications company can catch up. So what we need to do is we need to only legislate when we absolutely have to. I mean, I'll give you one example, self-driving cars. Do we need a separate law for self-driving cars, or can we just adapt the current traffic code so that it would apply to self-driving cars as well? So in most occasions, the laws that you already have are good for regulating human behavior, also oftentimes good for regulating technology. So that makes the Estonian legal system flexible enough for technology not to necessarily be developed in Estonia, but to be used in Estonia. Now, that raises a number of questions. So we are totally dependent upon the technology. I mean, we even vote online. Most people don't realize that. We have an option at parliamentary elections, at municipal elections, to cast our ballots from the comfort of our own beds. Take out your cell phone, you vote. I mean, this is as serious as it gets.
We have good cybersecurity.
We have, and that's the point. It raises the question of security. Another question that oftentimes is raised is the question of privacy. Now, we take privacy seriously. You go to Estonia, especially in the countryside, you will notice that the houses are as far from each other as they possibly can be. That's because we're I mean, you can't find more private people than we are. We don't want to small talk, thick curtains in front of every window. We're private people. So we don't like the government, or anybody else for that matter, to know what we're up to. So legally, for instance, the data that flows on that X-Road data highway, the data is owned by you as an individual. It's your private property. You own it. If you want to, you can turn it off. You can make sure, anytime you can log on, you can find out which government agency, which entity looked at what aspect of your data. If you don't turn it off, if you don't say no, then it flows, but you have that option. It's your own. It's owned by you. It's owned by you. So privacy we take seriously, but security obviously is of paramount importance. We found that out in 2007. We had the first, I think in the world, the first serious cyber attack that did not target narrow government servers or agencies. The government was actually, because it was fine. The government was fine. The target was not the government. The target was the society. And what we realized back then, smart people had realized already before that, but the society in general realized that, well, the fact that your military database or your intelligence services databases or your who knows what government systems are up and running matters little. When people cannot log on to their bank websites, when people can't get news online, when people can't do all they do online. And as time goes by, we're more and more dependent on those online services. And as a society, you cease to function. And the fact that the military system is up and running, that matters little if the society crumbles. So security is of paramount importance.
So has the online phenomenon moved to education?
Oh, and that's the key. So then we get the question, well, what's the most important aspect of security? Well, you can talk about high-tech things. You can talk about cyber commands and the importance of public-private partnership and international cooperation. And all of this is very important, of course. But the key without which nothing works is education. And here I'm not only talking about the top-level education where you need experts in these new subjects, artificial intelligence, programming. I'm talking about basic education. Oftentimes we call it, even in basic cyber hygiene. I'll give you one example. So we teach our children from the moment they are become teachable. We teach them to brush their teeth every morning and every evening. I mean, we view this not just as a private task, because we care about our children and their teeth. This is the whole society. This is basic knowledge. We want the next generation to learn to brush their teeth as soon as they become teachable. So now we're going online. And there are basic hygiene-related issues, like you don't click on links that come from odd emails, or you don't, if you find a memory stick on the street, you do not stick that memory stick into your computer. You have to understand that the person you are talking to online may not be who he or she says they are. Basic cyber hygiene. So we need to start teaching our kids. And the reason it's important for the safety of our kids, of course, like knowing how to brush teeth is important for their teeth, but it is also important for the society in general. In 2007, what happened to us, the attack was not sophisticated. It was a basic denial of service attack where people with lacking personal computer security had their computers taken over by bad guys, and then those computers were pinging our service.
Those bad guys from inside the country? Or
No, from outside the country, from next door. Now the computers, and by the way, just so that we would be absolutely clear, I am not referring to Latvia. Nobody in Latvia was involved. Nobody in Latvia was involved. So, basic education. And that is obviously, basic education is obviously also important not only for the sake of security, but also so that our next generation can take advantage of all the benefits that come with digital services. So you have to have at least basic literacy when it comes to technology. Just like we teach math, and we teach biology, so that not because we want every child to be a mathematician, no, but they need to have basic level of understanding of how this thing works. Otherwise, they won't be able to function as members of our society. Plus, if you don't start teaching young kids at an early age, then we will not be able to find the talents, those who are actually interested in this field, who end up, becoming professors and top-level experts. So you have to find those talents at a young age. So education at the primary level is really key. That matters. The final thought I'll throw in there, so that I wouldn't take up all of the time in Estonia, but much like with legislation, you can obviously create a separate, and you should, class on programming or robotics, and that's all good. But we need to figure out a way to integrate technology into the curriculum at a wider scale. Nowadays, the way we live as members of the society, we use technology not only when we want to program something. Most of us don't know how to program anything. We use technology when we order books.
Michael Saylor does.
Maybe a few, yes, indeed. So technology is part of our everyday lives, and it needs to be part of the curriculum at every level, not just the robotics class that has a technology aspect to it, but languages, history, you name it. So you need to immerse your children at an early age, and that's how you find the talents, and that's how you get the basic cyber hygiene skills at an early age as well.
Thank you. Ambassador Lorca, I wanted to ask you, Costa Rica is also a unique country, of course, and has a reputation for, in the hemisphere, being a stable country, but a country that's ranked very high in terms of tertiary education and people continuing along the education path. But I imagine you have challenges as well, challenges in terms of keeping that standard up. But what's your approach in Costa Rica? Are there any parallels here? Is it a unique case? But you've been pretty successful. What are the keys to that?
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador Holiday, for this invitation, and also want to thank the Meridian Center for organizing this panel about education, which is a very important topic in Costa Rica. It's impossible to talk about how we try to keep our population on the educational system without mentioning that, we put a lot of attention to the basics a long time ago. I have to say that in 1869, the basic education was declared mandatory for boys and girls in a constitutional level in Costa Rica. Despite that, we weren't able to have higher education as an accessible option for all the population until we had the first university in 1843 or something. And well, we basically...
19 or 18?
No, 18. But it wasn't, yes, 43,
It
but...
had been a Spanish, would it have been
Exactly.
Spanish
It was
colony,
one of those Catholic universities that used to train only a couple. You had two options: to become a chemist, or like a pharmacist, or to become a lawyer. But at the same time, during that time, we were able to train some school teachers. And that was very important because for a while, Costa Rica became a country of school teachers, lawyers, and some chemists that were able to provide some health services all across the country. But the most important decision was in 1948 when we avoided the army. And we were able to invest that money in education and in health. And that was, well, more than 70 years ago so far, and that was very important. The first public university came, because the other school actually closed in 1888, so it didn't last. And our first, what we consider our first strong public university came in 1941. For about 32 years, it was the only university in the country.
Sorry, population of Costa Rica now?
5 million.
5 million.
So we're talking about, yes, still a small country.
You've got a few more than that.
Yes, we do.
Exactly. But it's a population that has been growing but not that much recently. Our population is becoming old, so we don't have to deal with a lot of young kids. We are just keeping the numbers, so our population figure becomes cylindric. It's not a
But is that a
pyramidal.
risk to your economy?
Well, yes, you know, if for keep the going on, there is a risk, and there is also a risk for pension system and all the things, and the welfare state.
A friend of mine who was ambassador from the U.S. to Costa Rica, John
Yes.
Danilovich, I don't know if you remember him, but he said there were a lot of Americans living in Costa Rica, a lot of retirees moving down
Exactly.
there. Many thousands.
Well,
But that's probably contributed to your age curve.
maybe in some way. It's true that a 5 million people country is receiving 3.5 million tourists per year, and we know that the U.S. citizens become like the third or fourth foreign population living in the country, mainly retired. It's true, but no, our own population is all becoming so old, and we have to deal with that. But we try to, at the same time, we try to invest since early 60s in a technical training educational system. We were able to develop this institution. It's a public institution that...
Is that a two-year program, or the technical?
No, it's actually something after it's from people who couldn't really finish high school,
Okay.
but after 15 years old, they are able to access to this parallel
So it's like the last
system.
2 years of high school, sort of.
It depends on the program, but we have also another program, the one that you're talking about, that is officially accepted by the Ministry of Education, of a technical educational. They will access this technical education diploma that will count as the same as the traditional educational program. But it's true that it will take a couple of years, but if you compare both systems, it will take 1 more year than the traditional. But this program is not national coverage. I mean, we don't provide access to everyone. So recently, we approved a specific act to promote this system and to make it a dual vocational training program that is based on the German experience in this kind of models.
Apprenticeship model.
Exactly, working with the companies, the enterprises, and trying to see what they need as technicians or professionals, and trying to provide that first to the students and then to the companies as a real working options for them. We know now that the fourth industrial revolution is already here. We know that traditional education is changing. I'm not going to say that it will change. It's already changing, and we know that.
Do you have unions too?
A lot of, and we have to deal with. But it's true that, for example, the approving process for this recently the act approved was very, very, very hard in terms of the position that several actors from the society has about it. And of course, the union, they were, some of them were against it, and some others understood that this is the right moment to start changing that way, and to know that unemployment, which is a strong problem that Costa Rica is dealing with, talking about the huge challenges we have. We already reached 12% of our population is looking for a job, which is a huge number. And we know that training process skills, like in a country receiving a lot of tourism, to become a bilingual society is something that we already know is needed, and we are trying to provide that to this population. And you can't provide that asking them to go to university. I mean, you will have to find a way to certify them in some other different ways of training to keep them.
Because you all do a lot of back office and call center work
Exactly.
and for American companies in Costa Rica, right? So you have English as
It's very important for us. And just talking about that, yes, we export a lot of services, not only call centers, also financial services, and well, some specialized. And of course, in that kind of field, to have a great human talent is absolutely necessary.
Good. So, Will, since I can't ask you what the population of the OECD is, maybe you could share a snapshot of the mission of the OECD. But you all have just come out with some new reports on the state of education in the world. And I was wondering maybe you could give our audience a little bit of a preview or a snapshot of what the kind of key findings that you were able to take away from those.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ambassador Holliday, and thank you to Meridian for the invitation to speak to you this afternoon. It's an honor to be included on this panel with the ambassador from Estonia, one of our highest performing countries in education and digitalization, as we heard, and also with the ambassador from Costa Rica, who I can say with a relatively high degree of confidence is likely to be the next country to receive an offer for membership in the OECD. Madame Chargé, you're not in line for membership in the OECD yet, but it wouldn't surprise me someday. Yeah. So let me then just, as Ambassador Holliday has
she's
asked,
optimistic.
I am.
I am too. I am too. I can just briefly address what you asked, Mr. Ambassador, regarding the OECD's perspective on the state of global education and with a particular focus on tertiary education and vocational education. But first, let me do a little bit of housekeeping. I would imagine with a room full of educators, you already are fairly familiar with the OECD. By show of hands, how many of you have heard of OECD? Then I can dispense with this relatively quickly. Good. The OECD is not a country. It does not have a population. But we do have a headquarters in Paris that focuses on essentially everything that our member state governments focus on. So certainly education, but issues ranging from health to the environment, to migration, to taxation, to trade, and serving as a resource, essentially for everything that our member countries grapple with outside of the national security realm. We're something of a two-way street. We're a forum in which our member states come together to hammer out solutions to common challenges, but we're also a resource to our members, gathering data, providing analyses, producing reports that our intention, at least, is to help inform the deliberations of our members so that they can have more advanced discussions. On the education front, you're exactly right. My appearance here today is quite timely. We have a number of key instruments at the OECD that we use to assess the performance of the education sector amongst our member states. First and foremost, I would imagine many of you have already heard of Pisa, the Program for International Student Assessment. Estonia does awfully well in Pisa, so you can take pride in that. Yeah. I can't select favorites, but I'll leave that to you.
It's online. Check it out. I mean, you can just Google average results.
Yeah. It's public.
We had to have one ringer.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Every 3 years, Pisa surveys 500,000 15-year-olds across 79 countries now, much beyond just the 37 that are members of the OECD, and tests them on their achievement in reading, math, and science. And the 2018 results, as you cited, will be coming out very shortly. December 3rd is when the next round of PISA data is due to be released, and you'll have no shortage of access to that online. We also have something called PIAC, the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies, particularly relevant to the issues that I can touch on briefly today. This is a survey of 40 countries that will have a release of our round 3 findings tomorrow. So again, very timely. Sadly, still embargoed, so I can't give you a little bit of a sneak preview, but you'll have it, again, readily available on the OECD website, oecd.org, tomorrow. We also have something called TALIS, the Teacher and Learning International Survey, where teachers and school leaders in 15,000 schools across 48 countries are surveyed on their views, needs, and successes in terms of the challenges they face in educating students in their countries. And in addition, we have our annual flagship publication, Education at a Glance, an annual report that most recently just came out in September. It looks at who participates in education, how much is spent on it, how education systems operate, and the results achieved with individual country notes for all of the 37 members of the OECD. So we have a lot of tools at our disposal, and we also have a lot of data. And this is where you're going to have to excuse me, I haven't memorized every one of these statistics, so I'm going to glance down at my sheet of paper every now and then. When it comes to tertiary education, there are a number of trends that the OECD has found and has cited in our research. Primary of which, in 2018, 44% of our 25 to 30-year-olds across OECD countries held a tertiary degree, a dramatic increase compared to just 35% from a decade earlier. The global population of university graduates is expected to nearly double over this decade and will reach 300 million by 2030. China and India together will account for nearly half of all degree holders worldwide. College educated adults, our research has found, are more resilient against long-term unemployment. And in 2018, college-educated adults, their employment rate was 9% higher than that of adults with a high school education. College-educated adults, I think it's no surprise, also reap higher earnings. 25 to 30-year-olds with a college education can expect to earn 38% more than their peers with a high school degree, while 45 to 54-year-olds will earn 70% more than those without a college degree. Tertiary education is big business in OECD countries as well. Between 2005 and 2016, spending on tertiary institutions increased by 28% on average across OECD countries. And the benefits in terms of income are clear. Across OECD countries, the average private financial return from obtaining a tertiary education for a man is $295,000 US dollars over the course of their lifetime. The net financial return of a tertiary education in US dollars for a woman is $227,600 over the course of their lifetime. This goes to an important point. There is an ongoing gender gap in the education of our citizens across OECD countries. And although women currently have higher levels of education than men on average, men reap more benefits from their investment. The generally lower returns for women can be attributed to a variety of factors: lower earnings, lower salary, lower wages, lower employment rates, a greater share of part-time work on average, differences in the choices of field of study between men and women, and issues such as affordable and access to early childhood and child care. Early childhood education and child care can also obviously influence women's employment outcomes. There's one statistic that we follow at the OECD fairly closely that may be a relatively new one to you. When it comes to the global economy, it's a crucial indicator of whether a country's economy can be expected to develop, and that is workforce participation, something that we call NEET, those that are not in employment, education, or training. This gets at the percentage of the labor force that is essentially dropping out, which no OECD country can expect to see their economy grow without maximizing what they can from their labor force. On average, across OECD countries, 10.8% of tertiary educated 25 to 29-year-olds are NEET, while the share increases to 16.8% for those with an upper secondary or some post-secondary non-tertiary education. But this NEET population increases to 40.1% for those without upper secondary education. And no economy can be expected to perform anywhere near its peak without making sure it's taking full advantage of its labor force. What helps offset this dynamic? We found that vocational education can be a major tool in making sure that those that are interested and able to participate in the workforce are trained and flexible to do so. Many countries across the OECD have developed strong and robust vocational education systems. And this is important because in 2016, almost half, 44%, of upper secondary students across all OECD countries were enrolled in vocational tracks. So not everybody is going to university or college. These programs play a central role in preparing young people for work and responding to ever-changing labor market needs. Vocational programs turn out to be very resilient in economic downturns. In fact, countries that rely heavily on these, like Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, fared quite well in the 2008 downturn. High-quality vocational education and training can clearly make a major contribution to modern economies, and labor markets. And as jobs either disappear to a certain extent or certainly transform with time, vocational education and training can ensure that workers develop the skills that labor markets need. I'll touch briefly on the risks of focusing solely on higher education at the expense of, as you cited, Mr. Ambassador, the foundational or basic education. Highly educated people have never had a better chance in life today than what they're enjoying, while those, however, with poor qualifications have never faced a greater risk of social and economic exclusion. Those people with lower skills are facing a decline in pay, while a greater number of higher skilled workers have generally maintained, if not grown, their incomes, contributing to rise in inequality that we're seeing across nearly every OECD country. This is one of the key findings from one of the OECD's latest reviews of the annual state of education around the world, Education at a Glance, that I mentioned that came out in September. In much of Europe and North America, the shift towards knowledge-based economies has led more people to acquire more education and education has played an ever more important role in social progress. But it has not been a story of growing opportunity and mobility across the board. Rather, it's been a story of opportunity and reward being concentrated, our statistics show, increasingly among people who began their life with access to wealth and knowledge. School and university have become choices that reflect social and economic class, often reinforcing as opposed to mitigating some of the trends in inequality that we've seen. I can wrap up by a couple key points. Factors that contribute to this neat percentage of the population or lowering labor force participation are sapping economic performance across the OECD, and we need to look at policies that can reach out to this percentage of the workforce that is disenfranchised or left behind. Things such as vocational training, lifelong learning, ongoing training for those that are already in the workforce and need to acquire new skills as digitalization affects the entire economy. And we can look towards other issues such as this basic foundational education and social programs and other societal initiatives that can help to address the effects of inequality that we see the educational system not addressing, in which many of our member states are grappling with as the economy becomes more and more digital. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Will. Before we open it up to your questions, I, as the father of a college student who, after hearing Michael Saylor speak today, was talking about the skills he looks for and not necessarily the name on the diploma. It is interesting to hear the term education, and we use this sort of vocational training or apprenticeships as sort of a placeholder for what we mean as sort of skills development. But the universities, which of course the United States enjoys many, there's an expectation in America that to be successful you, quote, have to go to college. And I'm wondering if there's going to be a pivot point where, you know, it's going to be what skills do you have versus, you know, where you went to college that is going to drive the economic potential and the economic value of, you know, our citizens. But maybe just one question for the group. Based upon your statistics, you talked about that there's a correlation between education and obviously economic opportunity, poverty, communities, having all of that ecosystem that's necessary for achievement. South Africa, obviously, much bigger country, much more income disparity, bigger challenge. Do you try to leapfrog, as Estonia did, in terms of taking advantage of the huge challenge you have by looking at, you know, skills and what kind of training somebody will need to have a job versus the traditional four-year university model?
In fact, Ambassador Holiday, one of the things that the development of higher education and now science and innovation, because it's now combined with that aspect, what they're doing now is trying to change the mindset of the youth. Because society dictates that you should go through university so that you are acceptable and known to have been educated. That's how we were structured in terms of society. Now, at this point in time, we have 56 vocational training education center in the country, but we're hoping to have more of that because we now realize we need more artisans, we need more plumbers, because this is now responsive to the future of work and to the current. So we're trying to say not everybody can go through that stream. And we've got different criteria. If you don't meet this criteria, there are possibilities, and we now put more funding on the technical and vocational training and education so that we can then attract.
And part of that is also making that an honorable pursuit instead of saying that if you didn't go to a four-year university, somehow or another you're. But you know, in your countries, or your observation. Is that path, the non-university, traditional university path, is that an accepted path? And are you seeing, people gain meaningful jobs by developing, whether it's technology skills or particular, trade skills, or is there still that pressure to get it at university of wherever?
Well, I think there is still that pressure, and that is a pressure that is informed by the statistics that we just heard. I mean, there is a huge gap in income between those who have a university degree and those who don't. And there are obviously exceptions to those rules, as is always the case. Exceptions to those rules.
Like Mark Zuckerberg, for example.
Indeed, and we always and I think what did Bill Gates ever graduate?
I don't think so.
So people always bring these exceptions up, and they point to them.
Yeah.
That's all good, but then, I mean, we all wish we were Bill Gates, right?
Right.
So most of us are not. So there is this gap. So that creates that pressure. The question is, how do we as a society, how do we also value those jobs that do not require a higher education? And I mean, by valuing, I don't just mean us speaking nicely about people who don't have a college degree. I mean, that's all good, but it doesn't provide you with your bread and butter and doesn't help you build your house. So how do we value those jobs in the actual meaning of the word value? I always find it striking when we're discussing education and skills. There is always this point that people make, especially from the private sector. They tell us that, well, we need those skills and we need those skills. In Estonia, one of the coding. One of the topics that often comes up is, well, we don't need that many people with a background in humanities.
Yeah.
We need more programmers or mathematicians or engineers, and this, that, and the third. It's that same notion that the skill is what matters, not the degree. And that's obviously true, and we should pay attention to what our private sector is telling us. At the same time, however, we are not a company. We are a society. Mm-hmm. And we function as a society, not just because of the skills that we have, that I make wonderful spoons or something.
Right.
I mean, we function as a society because of the culture that we have. We're not machines. And I don't think we want to turn into machines that make a lot of profit for that businessman who then looks to hire us.
And a society has also, I think, somebody said that I think, how a society treats its art sector is a reflection of how sophisticated that society is. President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, Matt. So we can't ignore, any of these parts of the society because they contribute to the whole.
So that history teacher, whom we train, I mean, he or she has a university degree, may not make a lot of money compared to that programmer, but it's thanks to that history teacher that future programmer in high school knows who Nelson Mandela was, knows what we the people stand for.
Right.
And without that future programmer is not going to be he could be a wonderful programmer, but we would not be able to function as a society.
That's a great
so
point.
I think we need to pay attention to this as well. We are not in the business of turning into bio machines that make a profit for that high-tech company.
Right.
We are a society.
Very good point. Anything to add?
Yes, no. In Costa Rica, we have the same situation. If you ask a grandma what will like their grandkids to become, it's maybe a medical practitioner, a lawyer, the traditional professions. Let's name it. But the truth is that, and now we have this huge debate in the society that. There's a lot of evidence that companies need a lot of engineers. If you become in Costa Rica right now a biotech engineer, you wouldn't be even able to finish the whole program, and you will be hired already by a high-tech company. Costa Rica is not only exporting bananas and pineapples. We are also exporting, our main good of export is medical devices right now. So there is a lot of demand of this kind of engineering professionals. So the matter right now, the big question is what to study, not if you want to study or not. It's what to study that makes you develop in a better way. And yes, as we know in Latin America, we have, again, this inequality, huge inequality gaps that we have to deal with, and Costa Rica is not an exception. But we are aware, again, that the fourth industrial revolution is already here, and we know for sure that a lot of companies, the ones who hire professionals, they are not really interested in professions, traditional professions anymore. They want some specific skills, and we know that maybe retraining process, reinventing yourself, it's something that is going to become very popular nowadays, and we are trying to provide that to the population.
You know, we're all wrestling with these questions, and I think in the United States, I bet you in your countries, most of the students can point to a map and name most of the countries in the world, or at least the countries in their region, right? And in the United States, we have a challenge where many Americans are not familiar with the world to the extent that they should be. And I think all of us are grappling in many ways. Of course, we also have income inequality issues and so forth, but we're all in it together, and by sharing ideas like this and using data from OECD and looking at non-OECD, which is, do you have your own? What's the equivalent of? Do they have a club? The
Group of 77.
the G77. Yeah, of course, I remember that. And you all are, South Africa's a leader in that.
AU. Sure.
So let's open it up to questions from the audience. If anybody's, I know we're getting very close to cocktail hour. Yes, ma'am. And if you just say who you are and who you're with, that'd be great.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Philip. I am a doctoral student. Oh, I didn't need to have a teacher voice. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for doing this. It's a great pleasure to be part of the audience. I have a question for you, Mr. Davis. What software are you using for you to collect such massive data? And how are you analyzing it? Because I am a mathematician by trade. I teach math. But because I'm also doing my doctorate with innovation and learning and being part of HRA, I'm from Haiti. I'm actually working to create a 25 years educational plan. But I need to collect massive data because I listened to you, made me happy.
Google?
No, do not you say Google.
I'm joking.
Okay. What are you using? What's your software? Is it a... Let me just wait for you.
I can answer you very quickly. Come find me afterwards.
Okay.
I'll give you my card. Because even though I'm up here talking about education, I have no idea what software we're using to gather all of this massive amount of data. But I know how to find the person that does. So I'll be able to help you very quickly.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Great answer.
Great. Oh, is that right? Yeah. Okay, great. Other questions, please. Yes, ma'am.
It was a pleasure to listen to each of the ambassadors and all the thoughts that we were listening to very carefully. So I was just going by this lessons of the international community in modern education. So one of the thoughts, as an educator, which is on my mind is, what is the way forward? We are talking about technology, we are talking about lifelong learning, we are talking about, countries coming together, looking at the world problems in terms of be it peace, be it environmental issues, be it issues like depression. So what is the way forward? Is there one way that we can look at? All the data that we have come, interesting data points, but what do we do with the data? And what is modern education? Because these are some of the thoughts. I mean, are we really looking at individuals, people coming together, having a good life, creating a well-being, a society which is a more meaningful people coming together? So just a way forward, according to you, and possibly maybe a little bit perspective from each one of you.
Sure. Well,
Yeah?
since the
She just mentioned who you
Yeah.
are. So I'm from India. I'm Dr. Padmakali Banerjee, Pro Vice Chancellor of Amity University.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you for coming all the way. I think, just from my perspective, when we had an agrarian society and people lived in, communities where they stayed in those communities and professions or trades were passed down from generation to generation, the economy, the economic pressure was very different. And now I think, to your question is this a global challenge? Is it a national challenge, or is it a local challenge? And there seems to be now a firm linkage between economic well-being and education. And there are more people in the world. And I think, the question is, for me as I look forward, is how do you balance economic development with preserving the humanity of the community, the honor of pursuing whatever passion you have, because at the end of the day, human beings, if they're not pursuing their passion, are really just living from day to day to day to day, and that gets back to, I think, families as well, and how in this modern age, we support the ability of families to nurture their children, to provide them the basic freedom from fear. What was it, the 4 freedoms? Freedom from fear, freedom from hunger, freedom from want. I can't remember the other one. I think Norman Rockwell painted all these. But I think she's saying we've got the data. What are we doing about it? And how are we working together on it? Any 1 or 2 thoughts from anybody about it?
Not just from our side in South Africa, we are committed to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah.
And the SDG 4 talks about the universal access to education for primary and secondary. So this, you can look at it from a global point of view. So we're in that space, and we're really committed. There are things that we're doing as a country to make sure that we respond to those needs. But also, as a country that is a leader within the continent in Africa, we also have continental view to the issue of education, because we can't compare to Estonia, for instance, but within the continent, we can play a role as South Africa. But also within SADC, because also within Africa, we have sub-regions, and therefore issues are not the same, because this is a complex issue. And we're coming at it from a different perspective, because we're dealing with it differently. But also now, as a country, we also have our own interests and the way we want to deal with it. So we're dealing with it in that multiple factor.
Interesting.
I think the same point. I mean, making sure that no one is left behind, especially when it comes to basic education. The principle we think is most important is in Estonia at least, is the egalitarian nature of our basic education system. Yes, by law, I mean, up to 9th grade, it's also mandatory. But what is very important, of course, for any parent and in the future of any kid is also the quality of education. We need to make sure that schools in cities aren't in a different league from schools in the rural areas, for instance. What our societies are going through, I think not just in Europe and North America, I think globally, I mean, there is so much change taking place in the world today. Technological change, the way we communicate with each other, the way we get news, or leading to political changes, economic changes. Work itself is changing. This is testing the cohesion of our societies. creating risks that we as humans and mankind, well, we've seen before. And the ending has not always been happy.
Yeah.
So how do we make sure that we do not repeat the mistakes of previous centuries? I think nobody probably knows. I think education is an important element, and making sure nobody's left behind. I think that is, from my side, I would offer as the important principle.
I will say that I do agree with you. Everybody wants to be happy, and the possibility to search that happiness is something that we should provide to our population. And definitely, it's not a matter of becoming an engineer or a technician in something. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that new professions in terms of communication skills we need, and also what has been called the orange economy, that it's design, creativity. There's a lot of evidence that we need also those areas and more linked to art skills. I mean, it's not true that we all have to become a specialist in a very technical profession. I do agree the sense of society, trying to reduce those inequalities that will sooner or later will come back for us, and definitely to be able to provide all of these options to our population. It's what we should do, and definitely it's all levels situation, international, national, and local.
Yep. Well, I think we're getting ready to wrap up. I thought one of the interesting things we didn't talk about, just to put it on the table, is resources. And there's always a huge debate about whether the issue is how much money we're spending, or how we're spending that money. And that's a question for another day. But I wanted to thank all of you, and I think it's wonderful that we have such different geographic regions represented, but that are all basically sharing a commitment to improving the quality of education for their people. And I'd like to thank you all for being here, and thank you for the day. I understand tomorrow is it's going to be very exciting in the morning, and we have refreshments and a reception right out here. Please enjoy, and thank you for participating.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Very